We had a very good idea on how two people should work together, and that was that we should not contradict the other person's edits. We had sufficient faith in each other's taste to not try and go back and say, oh, you've cut my best line. If I'd given Richard something and he'd taken it in another direction, we said, okay, well, that's the direction.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if I said something to you at dinner and you didn't laugh, it would be odd if I then said, no, but seriously, what I've just said is very funny. And
but people do that.
And just repeat it.
We occasionally, on the tip of your tongue was, you've got my best line, that's so funny. But of course, the moment you try and explain to someone why you're certain it's funny, it gets less and less funny every second. So we had a very healthy relationship, partly because I think we were both, full of ideas. So it didn't matter to lose something. It didn't matter. It was fun. I
think we're both fast writers, and that's an advantage. I mean, on a normal working day, I would write 20 or 30 pages of dialogue. So consequently, it does mean that it didn't hurt
we
too
could
much
chuck a lot out
when we cut stuff. And I mean, it was good because what you could do is I often think about writing, and particularly sitcoms actually, as a little bit like a mixing desk in a studio. I don't know if this ever works for you, but there's plot, there's character, there's funny scenes, and there's funny lines, as it were. And I will tend to concentrate on each pass on one of those things. So I'll think, well, the plot just really isn't working here. So I try and scrunch the plot into a good shape. And then I'd hand it to Ben in the hope that he would find a way of making what was now a perceivably good plot line funnier. Now, and then sometimes it would work the other way around. I'd think of 3 good scenes, write those and think, I don't really know what the plot is here, but it's something to do with execution, and I think there might be a funny thing to do with this. And then it would be his job, and then, we'd both try and add funny lines. So that it was, in a way, very irresponsible, wasn't it? Because you could always, just at the last moment, say, well, I can't finish this, but I know there's lots of good stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great... You have to be working with somebody who really interests and inspires you. I mean, that's the point. I mean, for us to, we don't tend to collaborate on most of what we do. I mean, Richard, you tend to write alone, and I tend to write alone. But obviously, Blackadder was immensely, energizing because you were getting such great stuff. You can imagine what fun that was. We're talking, 22. This is 85. We were 23 years ago.
But also that was the other thing about the style of writing, which was that it was to some extent accumulative, and that, in other words, if I'd written, what I thought was, you're as stupid as a teacup, it would then be natural for Ben to say, well, I'm sure I can do better than teacup. So a teacup that's
been ill repaired with a non-heat resistant water solvent glue, and hence has fallen to pieces, or whatever.
Exactly.
So it was genuine fun. I mean, I don't know how much you could do it. I think by being very young and very energetic. I mean, we didn't see that much of each other because we'd worked. Richard lived in Oxfordshire and I lived in London. But as you say, the disc thing, very quickly. There's no doubt you are right about that. Computers really did help. It meant that we could actually work on each other's scripts and change them, within. And obviously you keep a copy.
There was a tragic thing that I used to underline anything that had actually made me laugh when I thought of it, because as you work on stuff, there's some stuff that's calculated and some stuff that's spontaneously funny. And I would attempt always, before I gave it into you, to delete those lines, to do a sort of clear all. But it was only a year or two ago that you said to me, what were those bits that were underlined, and you clearly never spotted that they were my finest work.
Well, the one, I didn't know you told me what you liked. That was what you explained to me. But you did used to have a habit of sort of ticking your favourite lines of mine, which always what's wrong with the rest of the stuff, you bastard? It's been a tick for 3 pages, and it's all brilliant.
But just taking it on, I think that the next part of the process, and I can't recommend the way we work too highly, because I've had some other dismal experiences where you sit in a room with somebody and just stare at them for hours trying to think of a funnier line, which is such a grim way of doing it. But once we'd finished the episodes, we'd then give them to John. John would give all his notes. We'd take those into account, and then we'd have a reading about 6 weeks out. And it's a great, and depressing surprise that no matter how hard you work on anything, some things just don't take wing, do they, when they're read? And there were always a couple which were not necessarily the ones we thought were the best, which because of the nature of the setup would just fly from the beginning and people would laugh all the way through. And then there'd be other ones which were stodgy and incorrect, and then we'd take that off and get to work on those again.
On the whole, those reactions were very useful. You have to be a bit careful sometimes. You know, they say never listen to the crew laughing because they're not laughing at the right things. Obviously, with the cast, we were working with some, very brilliant people, who, could spot a good gag, etc. And I think on the whole, they're always the notes, and the notes which were tended to be just like not laughing or looking very grumpy about having to say a line were very good.
I tell you what,
not always though.
No.
Sometimes,
I tell you what. I mean, there are problems. I mean, I think one of the things, and maybe that's the reason why, and I think it's to the benefit probably of it. It became very sort of tight and constricted. Is that in those read-throughs, guest performances would suffer, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Because, Stephen and Hugh and Rowan and Tony would be on the full roll, and then you'd get in some poor dolt
who was trying to get
read
into the scale of the
piece.
piece.
No, but I don't think they were even cast. There was someone who would be reading in Highwayman and
That'd
Duke
be,
that sort of thing, and so that wouldn't work out quite so well.
It was hard for the writers, i.e. Richard and I, in that process, because certainly when something was kind of when the guys who were at the centre of it, who really knew how to make their parts work, etc., it would always be great. And if they didn't like to say a line, pretty much no point fighting it. You just have to go away and think again because you couldn't do a week of grumpiness. So, but as Richard said, in a way, the proof of that it wasn't entirely constructive. It was mainly good, but there were things that suffered from the fact that there was this very high-powered team, all of whom could fill a room with a vibe, to say the least, if they were either amused or not amused. We had a great time working together. Then there were the read-throughs. They were often delightful, and people were extremely, thrilled to get some great lines. And there were moments when you're thinking, oh, come on, be a bit more positive. And Richard and I would definitely sometimes think that reading has been influenced by somebody who's not going to try and make it work. I can remember feeling that. Come on,
Well, also, there's sometimes, even at read-throughs, there's something as simple as the fact that by the time you get to the sixth one...
Oh, you'd read all six,
in an afternoon, and you have a bit of a feeling of we've heard that gag before.
But it was very good fun up to that point. Whenever I went into rehearsals, it was kind of, it was great. I think the give and take was terrific. They'd say, sometimes they'd ask us to come up with something new, and sometimes they'd have come up with something a bit themselves. But I didn't attend as much as you did, so how do you feel?
Where it used to be, I think, complicated was where, there were two things. One is there wasn't much rehearsing. I think if I'd been allowed to prioritise, I would have said 3 days script, 3 days acting the script properly, because sometimes on more complicated ideas where somebody had to be at a particular pitch, at a particular mood, where one person had to know something while another person didn't know anything, there was a tendency never to get on the floor and give it a go until you'd fixed it. So that was a bit frustrating. And then I think the other thing would be that sometimes in trying to fix one thing, you could hurt another thing, So there'd be a boring 4 lines where you had to set up the fact that they were going to the theatre that night. And everybody would attack those 4 lines, turn it into something different, and you'd be left with no setup for going to the theatre. And then they'd all move on and they'd say, well, why have we got a theatre scene? Because it hasn't been set up in the last scene. You said, well, actually, it had. And if you'd been willing to live with 15 seconds of dullness, we could have had a lovely scene. And they said, no, but what we've set up now is that he's wearing a hugely funny hat and the scene better be about that. So there could be frustrating things. But, of course, the great thing is that, in looking back after all this time, the great thing is that on the whole, the total effect was, and we have a couple of, as it were, splinters where we think we can still spot the fault lines. On the whole, all that hard work did lead to things being, rich and funny. So
it's Blackadder's love of language. I mean, the character loves to form a fruity sentence or to undercut a fruity sentence. I remember one of the first lines, first time we ever had a few bits of dialogue was, you know, sort of Melchett, you know, Blackadder, you are this, you are that, you are another. And he goes, I may be a this or that and another, but you, sir, are a git. You know, and it was an undercutting, you know, using language by going against the floweriness.
Yeah, that was the thing of him being, I mean, I think we realised there was, you know, there were two contradictory things in the way we used to write it. One of which was he definitely represented a 20th century sensibility. But anachronism, which is the word I was going for.
No anachronism.
No anachronism. No him saying...
What's the time? Oh, they haven't invented watches yet.
Yeah,
we always had this as our example.
Exactly. Lord Shaftesbury's walking down that avenue.
Yes, yes. What shall we name it?
What shall we name it?
Did we not allow ourselves a sandwich moment? I think we might have had a sandwich joke, I'm not sure.
Well, you...
Aldrich, I've had a brilliant idea. Take 2 pieces of bread and put... I think possibly, but...
I think that was being sarcastic about sandwich.
As if
being
anyone invented that.
With an unbelievable...
Because no one had ever put food in bread before, prior to a man inventing the sandwich. I mean, police. I suppose something like that, I mean, you know, I know this because I've been, as I say, the kids are so into it, but, you know, we're old woman where, you know, is this where the wise woman lives? That it be, that it be. Yes, it is. Don't talk to me like that. I'm not a tourist. Now, that was on the edge of breaking our rules, but we were very clear that you couldn't do absolute anachronisms. And I think the 20th century sensibility in, you know, a fairly, you know, a sort of broad, honest recreation of a sort of comic history was part of it.
But also that was resistant to the two sort of traditions that there were at that point, which were the the Up Pompeii tradition and the Carry On tradition, because whenever the Carry On people did it in the past, the whole thing was about anachronism.
Absolutely.
It was your uncle was a great historian. I remember reading his books at school. And I seem to remember you telling me that when we put out the first episode that he wrote to you and said he thought it was a misjudgment.
In high dudgeon.
To have written comedy about such a tragic event.
No, he felt we were being deeply disrespectful to the British Army. He'd served in the British Army and felt very strongly. And in his letter he said, because of course my father was a Jewish refugee, as was my uncle, and he said, your father who sired you, bit of a tautology, would not be here today were it not for the British Army. And I'm damn well aware of that and feel exactly as he does about the debt we all owe to the sacrifices of the past. So I was stunned that he had this reaction, because I felt the satire was loving and took into account the bravery. And it wasn't just that all the generals were idiots. Yes, Melchett was an idiot, but there was no suggestion that Melchett was, you know, was deliberately so or whatever. By the end of the series, my uncle, who's now long gone, wrote again to say that he'd changed his mind. And I think the last episode, certainly, I don't think anybody else ever thought we were being unduly insulting to the memory, but we certainly were. I hope our hands would have withered had we been so. But the last episode, Richard and I were very aware, I think, writing it, that it probably would be our last episode, and that you can kill, you know, if Blackadder had died of the plague at the end of Blackadder 2, I don't think he did, but if he had, it wouldn't have been particularly moving. But, I mean, to talk about men going over the top in the First World War is too livid a wound to ignore.
And it was the condition on which we wrote the series, wasn't it? I mean, that's I think perhaps why it feels powerful. I mean, I think it was beautifully made in the end and beautifully constructed, and I'm sure people have spoken about how that sequence of events occurred. But in a way, it had been, you know, the arrow shot off at the beginning of the series that it was always going to land in no man's land. We were always going to make them all die, so there was a genuine sense of loss and grief. It's a kind of lovely thing in the backgrounds of one's life, a little vibe, which is that somewhere you know that people are enjoying that, watching it. You hear rumours from kids that they do it at school. I went to a poetry reading competition in a school and someone came forward and did Baldrick's World War I poem, boom, 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 boom. And that feeling that you've left something behind that was a pleasure to do a long time ago and it's still rumbling on is a nice thing at nights.
You don't want to. I mean, this is something that I believe this is the first time Rich and I have ever been interviewed together about the Blackadder. We have been together, speaking together, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in the last 25 years. The first time we talked about Blackadder, and that's not because we're done and gone. No, I'm hugely proud that so many people seem to enjoy something that we had such fun doing. But the truth of the matter is that when I used to tour as a stand-up, people would come up the stage door every night and say, I expect you're going off for a bit of rat surprise, and it took me for, and obviously they knew the Blackadder script far, far better than I did. And it's hugely flattering, but I guess in a way the emotional, I have two emotional levels. One is to have been involved in something which has clearly given so many people a lot of happiness. That's fantastic. I personally don't feel as strongly about the Blackadder as a lot of the people who love it do, and that's as it should be, because I think you'd be a right tosser if you went around watching your own stuff and going, God, that's great, I love it, I feel so good about having written it. But the emotional fact that the Blackadder team, its initial core, I mean, for me, obviously being me and Richard, are still friends at this time, and that all of us are friends still, I think is something that if I ever do reflect on it, I find very, very moving. I spent a couple of days of our own only a few days ago. You know, Hugh and I corresponded in LA, whatever. But it's a terrific thing to still be friends after all these years, and to be able, I suppose, to appear on a documentary celebrating what for everybody else is a great series, if they feel it was, and I think for us was a great team and a great friendship.